Look at all of these beautiful Vue-loving faces. I really am so excited to be here because Vue is one of my favorite things in the world. Before we kick it off, I'd like to make an announcement. We've been working on a Vue cookbook for a little while now, and it was just released a couple of weeks ago in beta. So please check it out, enjoy it, submit recipes. It's going to keep growing over time. So yeah, that's really exciting. All right, without further ado, serverless functions and Vue.js. Okay, so how many people in this room can predict the future? Are there any like Bitcoin millionaires here or like early Apple investors? No? Okay. Well, for the rest of us, here's what it looks like when we launch an application. At first, if we're really doing a great job and we're super successful, we jump around in formalware, but the first thing we need to do is scale our servers. And you know, we want to believe that we kind of look like this, where we've got like a dope hoodie and an unbranded computer, and like we're so good at programming that our fingers are literally on fire. But chances are we probably look more like this. We've got like our older sister's rain jacket on, and we're looking for the Q key, and even when we do, we're not sure if we can exit Vim. So, you know, what about the more likely scenario that you don't exactly fail, but you don't get as many signups as you wanted right out of the gate? And that becomes really awkward because then you've got John Travolta in your wallet, and that's really hard to explain to the VPs. And you could scale down, but what if things pick up again? And then you've got to scale up again, and then, you know, you have to kind of communicate that out, and scaling is such a drag. So that brings us to serverless. It's an actually interesting thing with a really clickbaity title. I mean, come on, it's true. The first thing that people are going to tell you when you talk about serverless is, well, you know, you're actually still working with servers. And that's actually true. It's a bit of a misnomer. So what do we talk about when we say serverless? The promise of serverless is to spend less time updating and maintaining and babysitting a server. So the point that we're talking about for serverless functions and architecture today, it boils down to functions that state when a request comes in that does this, execute this function. For this reason, sometimes people refer to them as functions as a service, or FaaS. My name is Sarah Drasner, known as Sarah Edo on Twitter, and I work for Microsoft. Yeah. All right, so some of the benefits of serverless architectures include not getting ourselves into the situation that we mentioned before, that you're only paying for what you need. And actually, it's kind of a secret in the industry, but like serverless is a little inaccurately priced for the consumer. People like priced it too low, and now everybody's competing too low, so it's super cheap. And that's really kind of why I get excited about it, because it's really good for us developers. It's also great because you're in essence breaking things down to the principle of least power, which in programming boils down to functions that state, you know, when a request comes in, do this, so you can have reusable code. So it's the same idea as functional programming, where you're making small bits of things that are reusable across a few different applications. So that's really nice. And yeah, as I mentioned before, it's the principle of least power, so you're using the least powerful premises for any kind of programming concept, and that's really, really a cool thing about it. So we mentioned before that serverless can mean functions as a service, and there's a lot of as-a-service things out there, so I thought I would break down what that means in terms of all of the as-a-service things. So anything above the waterline here is what we're managing, and anything below is what the service is managing. So if we check this out, here's infrastructure as a service. Here's platform as a service, and here's functions as a service. So you can see you're not doing very much for functions as a service. You're really only managing the application. This is a SVG animation, so you can check out the code for this animation as well. So now when you deploy traditional server-side software, we start with a host instance and we deploy the application within the host. But in a serverless paradigm, we remove both and replace it with a vendor FaaS platform that we don't manage ourselves. We'll deploy these functions to this platform, And this allows us to just focus on the logic written as individual functions. So unlike the earlier host and application model, the function isn't continuously running. It's only executing when an event occurs. So should we serverless all the things? No, not really. Serverless, because of what I just mentioned, serverless is not very good for things like WebSockets or where you have to keep a connection present the whole time. So something like real-time social streams, or if you're like working with a gaming thing where people are chatting all the time, that kind of stuff serverless is not good for. So what is it good for? You can clean data on a cron job. You can take data and use it to create data visualizations, which we're going to do during this talk. We're going to crop images uploaded by the server, uploaded by the user, and create a user profile. And as mentioned before, I work for Microsoft, so I'm going to be using Azure for a lot of these things, but you can use any cloud platform. It's very, very similar. I'll even show you the line of code that you would change between these things, and it's all open source. Okay, so setting up a function is really trivial. We'll get a free account, go into the portal like this, and we have a number of options here that get populated for us. One of these things that I would like to point out to us is that we're going to be using the consumption plan. I just started using Keynote, so I'm like really into these transitions. It's not part of the presentation really. That's the default, and that's what you should keep it as, because that's the one that scales with how much you're using it. If you chose the app service plan, which is the other one, then you'd have to manually scale all your serverless functions, which is kind of a key reason why we're using those. Okay, so right away they set us up with a test, which I've actually modified and simplified a little bit so you can see it at a glance. And I've also done really important things like include tacos. So what we have here is we're passing in a name, so that's basically the parameter that we're going to be passing in. That's what we're going to be giving to our serverless function. And you can see here that's where we're passing it in. So that rec body name is referring to that. We can also do things like context log, which is similar to console logging. And so if we run this, you can see that our output becomes hello delicious tacos, which is a very important statement. And also you can see that yo, 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 which is another important statement, is now in our context log. So a lot of this stuff is really familiar to you, actually, if you start to play with it. So now we know how to set up a function. It's like the functions that you already know how to write, but instead of writing them on your site or computer, you're writing them on the server. So let's use this, put this knowledge to use and do like a kind of, general use case. And we're going to use Vue, Stripe, and serverless to create a whole e-commerce application really quickly. So here's a sample Vue application I made. There comes a time in any young app's life where you're going to need to monetize it, and there's a lot of ways of monetizing, but directly accepting cash is probably the best way to do so. So let's do that, and this is the application I built. It's all open source. I'll send you the link to the repo later so you can go check it out if you want to. So you can see we go all the way through the payment process. And since we don't have the time to go through every piece of the application, I'm giving you a bird's eye view of the entire structure so you can see how it's all set up. So it's done with Nuxt, and if you've ever worked with Nuxt before, or even if you haven't, there's a pages directory. So anything that's inside that pages directory are single file components. They're .vue files. And then Nuxt will set up the routing for us between these pages. It's super cool. You never have to step outside of a Vue file. So when we refer to those are pages in our application, but also Vue files. So we're going to talk about our serverless function and our app, but we're going to start with Stripe because that's the easiest part to set up. So you create your account. Once you confirm your email, you go into the sidebar in the dashboard where it says API. This will show you your testing keys. It's already all set up for you. And Stripe, according to the documentation, Stripe will assume that you're using Express. So you can see here we're creating our customer. We pass in the Stripe charges, the amount, and some details. But where we're going, we don't need Express because we're already on the server, so we don't need to communicate with the server. So that's really cool. So let's go through what we do to make this work for in a couple of different chunks. So we'd add in our Stripe testing key, then that module.exports, that's how you kick it off in Azure. That would be changed with other cloud providers. And then we have all of the creating the customer, the email, the token, the same way that we saw, and we're passing in the amount in details. And then we'll track everything, we'll finish everything up and provide some error logs. And you'll notice that I log a lot, and that's so that I can debug if anything goes wrong. Now, when we execute our function, we'll pass in what we're eventually going to get from the client, so a testing token, an email, some base charge, and you can see all of those context logs printing to show how our function did. And it was a success. If we go back to the Stripe portal, you can see some activity here that shows that the function's working properly and communicating with Stripe. So now here's one piece that we didn't have time to cover, but you don't necessarily have to use something like a portal in order to work with serverless functions. You can actually host them on GitHub, and even VS Code has some like debugging locally kind of things, an extension. So there's a lot of ways that you can work with it. If you want to know more information, I have a post on CSS tricks about that. So we don't have time to go through all of that today, but there's more information there. So now we've got all of this side done. Now let's connect to our serverless function and our app. So first we'll talk about that Vuex store and our cart.vue page. So that Vuex store and that cart.vue page that lives in our pages directory. So all of our products are in a big manifest object in our Vuex store. So we're also storing what's in the cart as well as the cart total. And you can see here as I add items, our Vuex store updates. And here's the shape of what we're going to build on the cart.vue page. First, if items are in the cart, we'll add them to our checkout component. Then if the cart is empty, we'll give them the ability to go back to the main page and add items. And finally, if there's a success, we'll let people know it's being processed, and we'll add a success component. So let's look at that first code block. If we have items in our cart, we'll show a cart that reminds people of the items with a thumbnail, the quantity, and its price. And here's what that will look like. We'll get the total by getting the values from our cart and create a computed value here. But now that we're showing what's in the cart, we also need that checkout component, which looks like this. This is what it's eventually going to look like. We need to get their email and their credit card. So the easiest possible way to add Stripe is this component called Vue Stripe Checkout. I've linked the repo up here. It's literally a button that creates this Stripe modal, and it's easy as pie to implement. But you'll notice that on our site, the checkout form wasn't a button. We actually made it part of the site. So it takes a little bit more configuration to do that, but I think it's actually kind of worthwhile because it makes your application look really professional, and you can do some things like unit testing and things like that. So there's a thing called Stripe elements that allow you to do this. And what we're going to be using is a thing called Vue Stripe Elements Plus, and you can npm install it or yarn add it and get started. So now we're going to talk about how that cart.vue page talks to our checkout.vue component. Out of the box, Vue Stripe Elements Plus has a few defaults, and a couple of notable things here. We have, let's see if this is going to work. No, you did not work. Okay, that Stripe has a Stripe key, and you can replace that with your key. And also that button has an @click-pay method. That pay method is going to be really important, so let's take a look at that. So in the script in the same component, we have some imports. You can see at the bottom of the page here, we have that pay method. Create token returns a promise which resolves in an object with a token or error key. So to configure it to our needs, what we need to do is store some data properties, including whether or not it was submitted, whether it was completed, the status, and the response. We'll also need to gather a bit of information from that parent component. So we have the total here as well as the success. So here we go. When someone clicks that button, we have that pay method, and we have a create token promise, but now we've changed submitted to true. We'll have an Axios post the URL of our serverless function, and we'll get their email that we collected from the form, our token, and the total. And in case you're wondering where I got that function URL from, if we go back to the portal view, that function URL is where we're posting to. So after that's complete, we'll change the status to success, clear the cart with a mutation in Vuex, and log any errors. So to review, because this part is really important, so that pay method is probably the most important part, we're using Axios to post our function to the function URL. We're tracking whether or not it was submitted with this.submitted. It sends the email, token, and total to the serverless function. If it's successful, it commits to the Vuex store, mutation clears the cart, and emits to the parent component that the payment was successful. If it errors, it changes the status to failure, logs the error response for help, with help for debugging. And while the function works its magic, we don't know how long it's going to take for the server to communicate, especially, maybe they're in a foreign country or something, so there might be more latency. So we're going to make a big loading component, which will actually reduce the perceived wait time that they're waiting through it. So this, a few seconds of waiting through this doesn't feel as long as just sitting there looking at a blank page. In the case of failure, oh man, I feel so bad for this cat. We'll let them know that something didn't quite work, but we're not going to clear out our cart yet because we want to give them the opportunity to submit again. And in the case of success, we'll show a little successful animation to get that dopamine flowing. So that we've got this payment cart, so we've got our loader that starts, and then our success. That will wait a bit, and then we reset the cart so that they can continue shopping and buy more items. You don't have to do it this way. That's just kind of like the UX flow that I appreciate as a consumer. So here we are now. That success is actually a component of its own, still attached to that cart.vue page. And it looks like this. I made a CodePen. Oh, sorry. I made a CodePen demo for you if you want to check out the code. So we'll create a set timeout event and restart the cart with a function on the parent emitted from here. Okay, so remember this view. Let's fill out what we did. So we created our cart, imported our checkout component, and that also tracks a successful payment. If the cart is empty, we let them fill it up by going back to the home page. If the payment was successful, we show a success component, restart the cart with the set timeout, clearing out what we have. Okay, you did it. Party, like we did in 15 minutes. We set up an entire e-commerce app, and you know how everything works from the serverless component to the application to the Stripe dashboard. Now, in a real application, there's a couple more things you'd probably want to do. You definitely want unit testing. You definitely don't want to be using the testing keys. You won't accept money if you're using the testing keys. And also, sometimes it's good to communicate the items and have the serverless function figure out the total with a manifest file in there so that you're not communicating any money on the client, but only the server. But all of those things are available to you in these repos. So I have two repos. One is the e-commerce site, and one is the serverless function if you want to check it out. And it should be usable for anything that you're doing. Cool. All right, in the time we have left, let's do one more thing. I mentioned earlier that we could have a serverless function fetch data and create beautiful front-end visualizations for Vue. So let's check that out next. As I mentioned before, I work at Microsoft as a developer advocate, and my team is all over the place. They're always speaking at different events, and I made this demo so that people could kind of explore where we're speaking at. So here I'm executing a serverless function to gather geolocation data for the pins on that globe, and I'm also making those pins longer if we're speaking there more frequently. So I'm not going to go into a huge amount of technical detail, but let's get the base concepts for how this works. So first, I get all of the data for where my coworkers are speaking. I download it from an Excel file, and I basically have a JSON thing that looks like this. This is like the format of our data. Everybody has the name, the conference they're speaking at, from and to, the location. But in order to work with that data visualization, I can't just put in Tel Aviv. I need to know the latitude and the longitude. So that's a really good case for a serverless function. So the cool part is you already know how serverless functions work. There are also things like GitHub webhooks. So anytime I push to master and change that data, I can have a serverless function update and change that data. And it's good to execute that stuff on the server instead of the client in our case, because I know when I need to update that data, it's not continuously getting updated from an API, and it's much more performant if it's done on the server than the client. I don't want to stall that visualization or anything. So here, we're going to retrieve the geo information for everything in the original data, and we're going to do that with the Google Maps API. And not shown here, we're going to error if it doesn't go well. And then, given an array of entries wrapped in an iterator, we're going to walk over each one of them and populate the latitude and longitude using that Google Maps API. And we're also going to cache locations to try to save some API calls. So now you can see our function at work. It's taking all of the locations in our JSON file in GitHub, looking up the locations with Google Maps API, updating it for quick retrieval with Vuex, our centralized state management store, and we're going to use this for the table and the globe. So we had this data, and now we'll have this data. So it'll update each entry, and I'm a lazy programmer, so I don't have to do that for each entry anymore by hand. So remember how the table was filtering as we typed? We're going to use a computed property to allow them to search that field first. So if you're not familiar with computed properties, this is a really important part to remember. Computed properties in Vue are extremely useful. They're calculations that are cached based on their dependencies and will only update when it's needed to. So this means that they're extremely performant when used well. A lot of other libraries and frameworks have to import a large amount of data in order to do something like this, but we can do this really, really quickly in Vue in just a few lines of code. Computed properties aren't used like methods, even though they kind of look like it. They're actually used more like data. So that filtered data, we're going to use like a data property in our code. So you can kind of consider them another view into your data. So now you can see if we look at this table, that filtered data, that's what we're using. That was that computed property that you saw earlier. And here you can see it in action. So if I select conference, you can see it automatically update. And I had that regex in there to kind of detect if it was capitalized or not capitalized, because we don't need that. Like as the user's typing, we don't need to require that they're making capitalization or anything. So as you might have noticed on our globe, we need a pin for each latitude and longitude. But that's not all we're doing. We're going to have to make it longer for repeat instances. So we'll check if the location already exists. And if it does, we're going to increment it. If not, we'll create new values for them. We'll use the data in this format to feed into our globe visualization. In order to work with Three.js, we mounted into the DOM on a single element. The code to create a globe is fairly large, so to keep things readable in this component, I'm actually going to use a mixin and import it, so I can keep things nice and modular. And you might notice that if we're using a texture in Vue.js, it's a little bit more performant if I actually create the texture first and then bring it in as a param into my mixin, and that works a little bit better when it's starting to render. And not that you'd want to do this, but because Vue and Three.js play so well together, we can actually update the appearance of this globe in one line of code. I could change it from a sphere to an icosahedron or any other shape that you can imagine. So we can make any myriad of projects in Vue and Three.js. The world of data visualization is literally our oyster. Serverless and Vue allow us to accomplish a lot without a lot of infrastructure. It's so cool how these technologies play so well together and allow us to accomplish a lot of tasks so quickly. I hope this gets you started playing with Vue and serverless in the future. Thank you.